You have here before you an image of the Earl of Oxford and his lewd friends. Actually, this is an image that's based on the Symposium of Plato, in which at the very end of that wonderful dialogue, he is counseling Aristophanes and Agathon, the winners of the comedy and tragedy competition, that the greatest playwrights, the greatest poets can write both comedies and tragedies. And we know that the Earl of Oxford possessed an edition of this. It was in Plato in Folio that he obtained when he was 19 years old. So in that spirit of symposium in which we eat and drink and share ideas together in an all-night party. This is a 4-day party. I want you to know that we're in that spirit of the symposium, and I want to go forward with that. Now, my talk today is a response in some way, guys, to Sky Gilbert's article on Hamlet's book in last year's Oxfordian 24, in which he proposed that the Greek philosopher Gorgias was more likely to be the source, the author of Hamlet's book, the one that he holds in his hand when he's talking to Polonius and mocking him about his age. Now, that flies in the face of Oxfordian orthodoxy that for many years has supported the idea that it's Cardanus Comforte, that Thomas Bedingfield translated and dedicated to the Earl of Oxford much earlier, that provides the basis upon which this is Shakespeare's book. Hardin Craig, writing almost 100 years ago, made that point in great detail. There are others that have proposed as much, and certainly as illustrious colleagues as Alexander Waugh and Elizabeth Winkler had put that question in print, that this is Hamlet's book. I'm going to suggest that the satiric rogue is actually somebody quite different. Now, when you have this Hamlet's book, here's Kenneth Branagh holding that book during his production, and I try to digitize this as much as Claire Short and get right down there and see whose title's on that page. I couldn't get it right. He wouldn't tell me. And so then I went to the next greatest expert in the world on this question. And I flew all the way over to Stratford. I waited outside the birthplace house until I could accost him. And he's actually holding the Hamlet's book, and he refuses to tell me. So I haven't looked into that. So I said, well, okay, where else can I go when I get over to England? Well, I had the privilege of actually asking Sir Derek Jacobi, and he said, well, he wasn't too sure, but we'll work on this a little bit. And so we recruited a whole army of friends who then began looking into the various books to try to figure out which one of the various sources were. And so our group think came together, and we decided that Hamlet's book was actually authored by the wonderful Roman satirist, Junius Decius Juvenalis. And that has been actually within the Shakespeare critical community for over 250 years. William Warburton was the first one to identify that. A number of other authors have subsequently confirmed that. And then in the late 19th century, early 20th century, scholars such as Churton Collins and H.R.D. Anders and others identified this as Shakespeare's book. But yet you look into Stuart Gillespie's current edition of Shakespeare's books, he says it's improbable that Juvenal, an untranslated source, was actually Hamlet's book. So I'm going to try to present evidence here that, in fact, it's probably Juvenal. And there's something new and fresh in my presentation here that I hope you might appreciate toward the very end. So stick with me as long as is necessary. So we're talking about Shakespeare's works being autobiographical, and there's no more autobiographical play, perhaps, than Hamlet. And then this is a quote from Harold Goddard. For nearly everyone, both Hamlet himself and the play give the impression of having some peculiar intimate relationship to their creator. Hamlet is the most bewildering, most fascinating of all plays, largely autobiographical. This is Shakespeare himself. So if you're going to be mocking somebody, who would you want to mock? Oh, Lord Burleigh, of course, who's in the position of Hamlet. And of course, there's for over 100 years, scholars have acknowledged the fact that Polonius is likely based on William Cecil. And the reasons are quite prolific. I'll review them briefly. They were both principal counselors to the kings. The cor unum via una was the family motto of the Cecil family, one heart, one way. Well, cor ambis was the character's name in the first quarto, which means split heart or double heart. So it reflects on actually that that very thing. Now, the certain precepts is what most scholars look to as, and I have a quote from one of those precepts that you'll be amused by, as being to thine own self be true, it shall follow the night and the day. So those qualities were reflected in the precepts that Polonius shares with Laertes. Of course, he's known to have spied on his son Thomas while he was a student living a slightly profligate life in Paris. And the same thing about Laertes and Polonius, who sends Reynaldo out to spy on him. And Cecil Ophelia, of course, fits that profile rather well. And Hamlet refers to him as a fishmonger, and William Cecil attempted to get Parliament to pass a bill that if you live within 15 miles of the coast, you had to eat fish twice a week, not just once a week. But that failed. And of course, it's been a recognized connection for over a century. Now, I kind of like, if you actually get a copy of those precepts, you'll be quite amused by them, and you would wonder why a young writer within the household might object to them in some regards and mock them at some point in his literary career. So this is one of those precepts. Use great providence and circumspection in the choice of thy wife. Let her not be poor, neither chose a base and uncomely creature altogether for wealth, for it will cause contempt in others and loathing in thee. Make not choice of a dwarf or a fool, for from the one thou mayest beget a race of pygmies, and the other may be thy daily disgrace, for it will irk thee to have her talk. And these are the kind of things that were in there. So I would think you should take a look at sometime at the precepts. They are available. Now, going back to the play itself of Hamlet, Polonius says, what do you read? Words, words, words. Oh, what is the matter, my lord? Slander, sir. For the satiric rogue, or the satirical rogue, which also is now the satirical slave in the folio edition. So satirical rogue becomes a satirical slave. So rogue and slave, oh, that rogue and slave, what a peasant rogue and slave, whatever, that soliloquy, he links rogue and slave together. The satirical rogue says here that old men have gray beards, that their faces are wrinkled, that their eyes purging thick amber and plum tree gum, and that they have plentiful lack of wit, together with most weak hams. Now that's the entire passage. And I'm going to point out to you how Juvenal's passage about what happens to you when you get old is much longer, but it encounters almost all the points that Hamlet makes in compiling the desperate state of aging. And these are a series of passages from the 10th satire. We're going to focus on the 10th satire. There were 16 satires. The 10th is the second longest one, and it is a satire, just to give you a little background on it, that is a cautionary statement of all the things that you can do that when you overreach. He talks about how there was a fatal flood of eloquence that affected Demosthenes, Democritus, Seneca, and Cicero. They all went down because of the qualities of their speech. He talks about how the overreaching ambition of certain political characters, such as Sejanus and Pompey, Hannibal, and particularly Alexander, would lead to their downfall. He's pointing out that if you pray for a long life, you may end up in a very weak and disabled state. And that's kind of what the passage is all about here. He says, but a long old age is full of continual evils. Look first at all for the face, unshapely, foul, and disgusting, unlike its former self, a hide, not a skin, and chop-fallen. So look at the wrinkles too, like those of a mother baboon, carves out on her face in the dark shade of the Numidian jungles. Wine is no good anymore, food everlastingly tasteless. As for the act of love, well, that long ago was forgotten. So we're staying out of the bedroom, thank you. This is a state of things to pray for this impotent sickness. When desire outruns performance, who can be happy? But worst than all the bodily failings is the weakened mind that presently cannot remember names of slaves, nor the face of a friend he dined with the last evening, cannot remember the names of offspring begotten and reared, the plentiful lack of wit that Hamlet reflects on. So that's why the scholars, I believe, turn to Juvenal's 10th satire as the source for that. Now, this is an untranslated source that was never published in England that I know of in Latin form. It was later translated sometime later in the 16th century. I think John Dryden did a translation. The 10th satire in particular drew a lot of interest. It has become proverbial for other passages such as, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. That comes from the 10th satire. If you wiki that, they got the wrong answer. It comes from Juvenal. They have it wrong. They think it came from a 19th century play, but Juvenal was the originator of that. Or if you're having an argument with somebody and you don't like what they're saying, go jump in a lake. That's a Juvenal expression. And they're not giving us anything but bread and circuses. That's Juvenal, all from the 10th satire. And I believe there's more in the 10th satire than just this passage on the depredation of old age that ties it to Hamlet in unique ways that have never been recognized by literary scholars. So we're going to kind of go into something a little bit speculative on my part here that I think ties Hamlet, the text of Hamlet, closer to the text of Juvenal than has been previously recognized. Now, who was he? Well, he lived in the 1st century, a common era. He was identified as Shakespeare's satiric rogue by William Warburton. And in Shakespeare's book, H.R.D. Anders agrees this seems very likely. He also suggests that the 15th satire may also be impact images that turn up in Much Ado and in Troilus and Cressida. And I will say that 15th satire also, I believe, has an impact on the poet's imagination. One of the most critical and important and beautiful passages in Hamlet itself that have not been previously recognized. And I really only happened upon this a few weeks ago when I was drawn to, okay, let's go read that 15th satire. And it turns out there's something really interesting there. Now, Churton Collins really hits this pretty well. And he was writing in 1904, Studies in Shakespeare. Juvenal was not translated to English until after Shakespeare's death, but that he had read him seems certain. He is the satirical rogue who Hamlet is reading, and the terrible picture of old age in the 10th satire to which Hamlet refers seems to have haunted Shakespeare. And you can think of the 7 Ages of Man, among other the passages. Now, he wrote anonymously, like Shakespeare, because what he wrote was so subversive, so embarrassing to the leadership in Rome, so attacking the corruption of the Roman polis that he had to write anonymously. But he got outed and eventually was banished to Egypt for an undetermined period of time. His satires were suppressed for over a century afterwards, but the early Christians happened upon his text and began copying this out, and eventually went into publication with the invention of the press because he was so critical of the pagan world. They're so incisively critical on so many incredibly wonderful ways and with such beautiful Latin poetry. Now, I don't read Latin. I never studied it other than medical Latin. But I understand from the commentaries of the people who really understand it that he was a master of the poetic, of Latin rhetoric. He was praised for his technical virtuosity, his dense, hard verbal brilliance, sounds a bit Shakespearean, that his parodies other authors, including Ovid, Horace, Homer, Lucretius, and especially Virgil. So he actually parodied and mocked other authors that were earlier authors and contemporary authors. Of course, Horace, Marcius, and others were writing, but they were writing with their names attached to their works. Juvenal knew better than to do that. Where Virgil glorifies, Juvenal belittles. So it's like Troilus and Cressida a bit. You know, you think about this, that you're deconstructing or demythologizing the heroic literature that came previously. Gilbert Hyatt, who's a real Juvenal advocate, says that Juvenal is the greatest satiric poet who ever lived. That's why he is the satiric rogue. There's no question in my mind about that. But his topics include satires against luxury, vanity, sexual depravity, wartime violence, and that was particularly true of satire 15 that I'll talk about at the end of this, and cliched literature. He was banished from Rome, as I mentioned. Dante placed him among the other great classical writers of that era, including Homer, Ovid, and Lucan. Erasmus included many of Juvenal's epigrams in his proverbs and adages, and Ben Jonson's Sejanus, 1603, opens with courtiers quoting Juvenal. So among the university wits in Johnson, they knew Juvenal well. Shakespeare, well, perhaps he heard about him in the Mermaid Tavern, I'm not so sure, but we have some very specific literary connections, some intertextual connections, I believe, in the images and all that we've already shared, but we can go further. Perhaps Juvenal's greatest poetical achievement is ability to marry sound, sense, and rhythm into one organic whole. His ear for the nuances of vowel sounds and consonantal patterns is acute, and few Roman poets can equal his absolute control over the pace, tone, and texture of a hexameter. Verbal dexterity is reinforced by pairing but dramatic use of simile and metaphor. Now, that sounds like Shakespeare to me. I'm thinking that if you're reading this, and we know Shakespeare or Oxford, read Latin, and he was well versed in the Latin canon and wrote in Latin, that Juvenal would have been one of his inspired sources. Now, I'm going to push this a little bit further and pointing out passages from Juvenal that echo Hamlet that have not been previously reported to my knowledge. Much of this argument is in the letter to the editor in the current Oxfordian. So if you're a member, you can always access that online. And most of what I'm telling you now is contained in that argument. More often than once, this is from Juvenal's 10th satire again. More often than once, a country has come to ruin through the desire of a few, their lust for praise, for the title that might cling to their stones and stand guard over their ashes. Stones that the barren fig trees has crude enough vigor to shatter, seeing that even tombs have a day and doom allotted. Weigh out Hannibal's dust. How many pounds does he come to? The greatest commander of all. So he's going into the dust and the fact that tombs and monuments will disappear in time, that in view of eternity, even those great stone monuments will dissolve by force of nature. One world, so it seemed, was too little for Alexander. That unfortunate youth raged against its borders, too narrow, and yet was at the end happy with the sarcophagus's bonds. Death and death only announces what little things are the bodies of men. Now, if you look at Shakespeare, in Hamlet, he has passages that reflect the same concept of how our bodies become dusty, remains. Why? May not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander till it's stopping a bunghole? Or Alexander died, Alexander was buried, Alexander turneth to dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam. And why of that loam? Whereto he was converted, might they not stop a beer barrel? So the obsession with great heroes being reduced to dust is in Juvenal, and it's very much so in Hamlet. Okay, now, if you recall the first player's speech, kind of an it's a completely separate style of rhetoric. It's in a kind of I've read that it's described in a Lucan style. So in an ancient Roman style of speech is the first player's speech about the death, the slaughter of Priam by Pyramus, and the distracted, hysterical running around of Hecuba, and I'm going to read what Juvenal has to say. At the conclusion of the 10th satire, he goes into a long description of, wouldn't it have been better if Priam had died before the ships had sailed and retrieved Helen and brought her to the, he says here, what did Priam's length of days bring him? The sight of his age overthrown, and the sword and the fire and the work of destruction. So he put off his crown, and a trembling old man, but a soldier, fell like an aged ox before high Jupiter's altar, giving his ancient throat to be cut by the knife of his master. Such was Priam's fate, but at least his departure was human. Hecuba entered her days as a yapping bitch by the seashore. And this is a reference to Euripides' Hecuba, where she takes revenge on Polynester, who has killed her son Polydorus, and it's by the seashore. So it's a specific reference to a Euripides drama at the very end that Juvenal has created. So he goes into some great length about pity Priam. He should have lived, much shorter life. It wouldn't have been a problem. So this is from Shakespeare in Hamlet. Striking too short at Greeks, this is Priam. His antique sword, rebellious to his arm, lies where it falls, repugnant to command, unequal match. Pyrrhus, as Priam drives, in rage strikes wide, but with the whiff and wind of his fell sword, the unnerved father falls. So again, a description of the father, hopeless, helpless before the revenging son of Achilles. And so it then goes on. When she saw Pyrrhus making malicious sport in mincing with his sword her husband's limbs, the instant burst of clamor that she made, unless things mortal move them not at all, would have made milch the burning eyes of heaven, and the passion of the gods. So again, the yapping bitch by the seashore made Milch the burning eyes of heaven and by the seashore. So again, you have two themes in addition to the descriptions of the terrible things that happen to old men that Hamlet compresses into about 5 lines. You have the quintessence of dust idea, and you have the idea that heroes are reduced, and that living too long sometimes can have a problem. He gives the primary example is the life of Priam, which of course is extended, narrative within that the first player speech gives in Hamlet. So I believe these two additional elements underline the likelihood that there's an intertext between Hamlet and the 10th satire of Juvenal. So in summarizing this 10th satire, in 100 lines, Juvenal gives us one of the earliest and one of the greatest of the many denunciations of old age, which have come down from aging poets, lyric or satiric. So the early commentators included William Warburton, H.R.D. Anders, and Churton Collins, but the 21st century scholars, including, and if you look in the editions of Shakespeare, you don't see Juvenal listed as the source for that in most current editions of Hamlet. And Stuart Gillespie, the author of Shakespeare's books, 2 editions of it, I looked in both editions of it, he says unlikely that Juvenal was involved. And I think the idea is that it's uncomfortable acknowledging an untranslated Latin source. Although, they acknowledge Plautus, of course, was a comedy of errors. But they're uncomfortable with that idea. And then, but you have the images of Alexander's degraded, dusty remains and other heroes too from that. And then the first player's speech and the narrative of Priam and Hecuba's tragic fates. So we're doing very well here. I've only got one small piece to add at the very end here. And this is fresh, new stuff that didn't end up in my letter to the editor, but which I discovered just a couple of weeks ago as I was reviewing this slide presentation and realizing that H.R.D. Anders looks at the 15th satire as being also an inspirational passage for Shakespeare, but for different reasons from what I'm going to share with you. Anders was a great South African writing around 1900 on Shakespeare. So he has this passage that he believes from the 15th satire that affected Shakespeare's imagery. Wild beasts spare their own species. When did the stronger lion ever strike down the weaker? Now, we know this is not true, okay? So this is satirist writing about these things, okay? So maybe he's lying a little bit, he's stretching the truth, whatever it is. And he says, and was there ever a forest in which some boar was slain by a bigger boar's tusk? The savage Indian tigress dwells in unbroken peace with her fellow tigresses. Surely bears too agree with their kind. Well, and he points out that there's 2 passages within the dramas of Shakespeare, one from Much Ado. The 2 bears will not bite one another when they meet from Much Ado, and one bear will not bite another from Troilus and Cressida. Now, that's, I think, weak evidence that there's a connection between the 15th satire and Shakespeare's artistic imagination, but maybe that's it. It's an amusing image. But I think far more interesting is this last passage I'm going to share with you from Juvenal from the 15th satire. And the 15th satire is an attack on humans' inhumanity to man. It's the last extended satire. The 16th satire has like 60 lines. This has 170 lines. Most of the satires have about 200, 250 lines in them. They vary quite a bit in distance. This is a quote from that. Today, the earth breeds a race of degenerative weaklings who stir high heaven to laughter and loathing. Okay, and he starts off by talking about how 2 villages near each other, but worshiping different gods, will escalate into an all-out war. One will have a festival. Well, the other doesn't want them to have such a good time. So they come in and they break it up a little bit. They interfere with it. And then there's retaliation. And then there's more retaliation. And pretty soon there's all-out war, including the slaughter of people and the cannibalizing of them. So he really goes down into the horrific quality of communities worshiping different gods and going to war with each other. So that's the bulk of this satire is going on about the inhumanity of man to man. And yet then he finishes up near the end of it in a very, Shakespearean way. He switches and shows us that's not always going to be that way. He says, when nature gave tears to mankind, she will proclaim that tenderness was endemic in the human heart. Of all the impulses, this is the highest and best. It's this that sets us apart from dumb brutes. It's why we alone have a soul that's worthy of reverence, why we're imbued with the divine potential and skill to acquire and practice all manner of arts. Remember these lines, all manner of arts, it's our soul, all manner of arts. We possess that heaven-sent faculty denied to the creeping beasts with their eyes on the ground. To them, when the earth was still new, our common creator granted the breath of life alone, but on us, he further bestowed sovereign reason, the impulse to aid one another, to gather our scattered groups into peoples. So it's a very redeeming concept of what it is that makes us truly human. What is the foundation of our soul? It's our ability to feel with sorrow, with tears, and reason. Those are the things that give us the difference between us and the beast. And of course, Hamlet says, what a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man pleases me not. So you see the source, perhaps, of this incredible passage of Hamlet in which he's reflecting on all the potential and possibilities and beauty of human life. And then he turns it and says, it's quintessence of dust. What is this? And man pleases me not. And so there's a despair at the same time. And I know that Juvenal is despairing of the warlike nature and the inhumanity of people to each other. So in conclusion, we have some Oxfordian connections here I want to add, okay? There were no English translation of Juvenal satires during Shakespeare's lifetime. Oh, and the inventory of William Shakespeare's library from that era includes a copy of Juvenalis and Persius from 1538. Of course, Robert Greene is identified by Thomas Nash as young Juvenal, that biting satirist in Groatsworth of Wit of 1589, a text that we all know quite well for its references to an early version of Hamlet. So I would plead to you that while Jerome Cardan's philosophy was clearly influential on Shakespeare, and that Bedingfield's translation was an inspiration to the author and to the Earl of Oxford in his literary concepts and his deep philosophy, and Gorgias may be equally important or very much important if he was available. I don't know that there was a copy of Gorgias in Cecil's library. I didn't have a chance to look that one up, but I do believe that Decius Juvenal is probably the satiric rogue, satiric slave that is referred to. And I have this image that this is from the same edition that was in Cecil's library that we have in the inventory there. So I think I've opened up an opportunity here to consider the fact that there's still things to be learned about the greatest literature in the world, that the philological investigation of sources, and I'm mostly interested in the Greek sources, though I do not read, I have small Latin and no Greek, okay? And yet I can find these things simply by looking and having an ear for a dialogue that makes sense to me and sounds like, oh, that sounds like Hamlet. Being familiar with the text of the plays themselves by virtue of having gone to them virtually a couple hundred times over the years of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, my ear is attuned to some things. When I came across this passage in Juvenal in the 15th satire, I thought, wow, that surely sounds like Hamlet lamenting what it is that where our potential is and what we lose by ignoring that great potential.